All right, it's Mario Small. It's a pleasure to be here. I hear you've had a pretty intense 5 days, and that you are just past whatever the equivalent of the 7th inning stretch is. So I appreciate you coming. And you just had lunch, so it's like right in the middle of afternoon nap time after 5 intense days. I will do my best. Luckily for you, or unfortunately, or maybe a little bit of both, I have to catch an airplane, for which I have to leave here at 4. As in, I have to be outside in the car at 4. And so we're gonna cram. I know, don't worry. No. Let me rephrase that. We're going to exclude a lot of material that I was going to present and focused on the most interesting and important aspects of it. The other thing I decided to, so anyway, we're going to talk for about, I don't know, an hour and 5 minutes. My alarm's going to go off to make sure we get a break. Then we'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back, and then we'll do another 50 minutes to an hour. So it'll be short and sweet, but I promise I'll give you something to think about. I also decided, the second decision I made is to make this largely a conceptual talk. There are actually no regressions almost anywhere. Not one regression almost anywhere. I think there's one in the very, very last session. But at the same time, we're going to talk about things that actually are quite important, regardless of whether you're an economist, sociologist, political science, psychologist. What fields are you? I know a lot of you are economists, sociologists, political scientists, or government people, as they're called in a certain university in the East Coast, psychologists, anthropologists, historians, demographers. There we go. All right. Okay. So economists et al. You're going to, so this is actually going to be very, very different from the kind of presentation that most of you are used to, on purpose. We are going to not talk, there's not going to be a lot of data, but there'll be some data, but this is largely a conceptual conversation. And it's a conceptual conversation about the need to think about data broadly when we think about neighborhoods and how neighborhoods matter in people's lives. So it's not going to be light in that it's not just going to be pretty pictures, although there are some pretty pictures. But hopefully it'll be something that after 5 days of intense lectures, you can remain concerned with. Okay, so the substantive focus for the afternoon sessions is neighborhoods and neighborhood institutions. But the thematic focus, so that's the kind of our case. But the thematic focus, really what we're going to be talking about ultimately is, as I've said, about the importance of multiple kinds of data, including data that may be uncomfortable to think about as data, given your disciplinary background. And this is regardless of your background. So if you're an economist or a demographer, how do you think about ethnographic data, right? We're at a very nice stage in the development of the social sciences where, unlike 20 or 30 years ago, there's not, at least in many circles, this sort of quantitative versus qualitative debate, and at least everybody who's kind of broad and sophisticated understands that you need multiple kinds of data to understand things like neighborhoods or organizations, or certainly many of the things we care about in the context of inequality. But what's interesting is that even in spite of that, there's a lot of gap between that understanding and what we take to be our ability to evaluate those data. So for example, suppose I gave you an ethnography written by an anthropologist or a sociologist. The book, like, many of you have heard of, for example, of Evicted. It's a book that was based on field studies in Milwaukee, or there have been several in the last few years that have been pretty popular. On the Run, the study of the young boys by Alice Goffman in Philadelphia. So I give you this book, and I ask you, tell me on what basis you are going to determine whether this is an empirically good ethnography as opposed to an empirically bad ethnography that just happens to be really well written. I am certain that if I ask many of your faculty across the social sciences, first of all, many will say, I don't know. But many will have very, very different ideas about how to make that distinction, where that line of demarcation is between good science and bad science when it comes to something that's outside of the disciplinary boundaries. The same is true from the opposite perspective. If you're, say, a sociologist or an ethnographer, and I give you a really good policy-relevant history book, Alice O'Connor's book about about the development of welfare reform research. What makes this a good historical book from an empirical perspective, as opposed to a pretty bad history that just happens to be really well written. I will argue, and I will show a little bit, that thinking seriously about very different kinds of data is essential, regardless of what your discipline is, to your understanding of inequality. And so even though our case is neighborhoods, really the case of neighborhoods is just a way of understanding more important issues about the significance of thinking in a Catholic way about data quality if you want to be a good social scientist, I think, in the 21st century. So that's it. That's the bottom line. And as I said, the approach is conceptual. There is some data, but it's conceptual rather than empirical. OK, the context. I'm just going to assert that neighborhoods matter. And I'm just going to ask you to give me that one, because we would have to be here another hour if we had to assess all of the evidence in favor of this proposition. At this point, there's pretty strong consensus across the board. Oh, there we go. Actually, oh, that's not, perfect. He's right there. So there we go. And what's good about this is that there's qualitative data, like field ethnographic data. There's experimental data, field experimental data from the moving to opportunity studies. There's large-scale observational data from the tax data. There's tons of very different kinds of data, all of which converge at some version of the same idea, that neighborhood poverty makes your life worse. The questions are really how much and what kind of neighborhood poverty and for what particular outcomes. So those questions still remain open, but the broad claim, I think, is fair enough to say. There's evidence, as I said, on mobility, impacts of mobility, subjective well-being, physical health, cognitive development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm going to show you are 3 ongoing studies. None of the work I'm going to show you is complete. This is part of the reason I'm only going to show you a little bit of data. But I try to get at the questions that I think are the important questions to answer now, which is sort of why does this happen? So congratulations, you're on an experiment and you saw an effect. Well, good. But social science, and especially policy, requires far more than just that. You may have been in one of the schools of thought, I'm not in part of the school of thought, by which experiments are sort of the gold standard, and everything else is sort of an approximation of a randomized controlled trial. There are people who think about methods that way. I'm not one of them, but suppose you are in that world. So you did a field experiment in 5 cities, Baltimore, Chicago, New York, LA, I forget what the other one was, Boston. And the moving to opportunity, you found this beautiful effect. It was perfect identification, people follow, et cetera. You had everything perfectly and all worked out. So you saw an effect. Those are just 5 cities. What is your confidence that if you had picked Cincinnati, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Tucson, you would have found the same thing. In fact, across those 5 cities, I don't know how much you got into the details, but there's heterogeneity. For some outcomes, you only see effects in Baltimore and Chicago, and not in any of the other cities, for example. So even if you had some version of that, really to understand what's happened, you need far more. At a minimum, you need some basis to figure out where you would run the next experiment, right? So you have limited funds. If the government says, OK, we want 5 more cities, how do you pick? Pick them at random? Actually, not obvious that's the best thing to do. Some understanding of what to make of what was happening in those cities, I think is essential to thinking about where you go next. So, OK, so we need to understand sort of why you found an effect, why sometimes you don't find an effect, what in some languages sort of what are the mechanisms behind neighborhood effects. We need to understand the question of heterogeneity across subpopulations, the findings that I'm sure you covered yesterday, that there are stronger effects for boys and girls in some contexts, and others it's the opposite, it depends on age, et cetera, and also heterogeneity across treatment settings. In other words, we're at a stage where the easy questions have already been answered, and the interesting and harder questions, both scientifically and from a policy perspective, remain to be answered. And what I'm going to do is to show you a couple of studies that I argue point to the kinds of things we have to understand to get those answers, and studies that I argue would not have come about had we not done fieldwork, literally ethnographic fieldwork, and paid attention from the perspective of the kinds of things for which ethnography is good at empirically, at what we were learning from those field studies. Okay, so the first study, what has happened in poor neighborhoods and what is the role of ethnography and observation in understanding it? So, so ethnography actually makes a difference. If you write a paper on anything and you find an effect, even in the worst journal in any field you can imagine, you have to tell us something about why you found that effect. Even if you have no actual evidence that the mechanism underlying the effect is the one you said, is the one you're sort of hinting at, you have to give us an idea. And what's interesting is that both ethnographic studies and journalistic studies, and actually I should also say television shows like The Wire, it turns out play a big role in how we theorize what we imagine is the consequence of neighborhood poverty for people's life chances. Now what's interesting is if you think about this, going back to the difference between a good ethnographic study and an ethnographic study that might be bad, but just as interesting or provocative, you can imagine that a lot of the ideas we have seem to be right because they're consistent with what we've seen on The Wire or what a particular ethnography that happened to be very popular reported. But unless we have some understanding of how to assess that ethnographic evidence as evidence, we have no reason to propose that whatever our intuition is about what's happening, what's in the black box of our demonstrated neighborhood effect with our beautiful identification or our great experiment or whatever it is, unless we have some understanding of how to distinguish a good ethnography from a bad one or an ethnography we shouldn't take seriously from one in which we should, there's going to be actually no difference between just intuition and actual assessing of the evidence in proposing what's in the black box. And what's more, what's even worse, we could have a completely wrong understanding of what's happening in poor neighborhoods because a lot of us are relying on, for example, pretty bad ethnographies or ethnographies, all of which were in the same kind of neighborhood, that it happens to be unrepresentative, or ethnographies, all of which were done, for example, in the same city, like the city of Chicago, because it happens to have a couple of really good universities with a whole bunch of graduate students who want to be ethnographers, et cetera. Sampson and Raudenbush, I think, put this idea out well when they said, look, the visual signs of physical disorder in public spaces reflect powerfully on our inferences about urban communities. What ethnographers or journalists or observers report that they've seen plays some role in how we theorize what's happening in poor neighborhoods. And I want to assure that actually this matters. Just to give you a couple of examples of this, I think everybody in this room is familiar with William Julius Wilson's The Tool of Disadvantage, in which, is everybody in this room familiar with William Julius Wilson's The Tool of Disadvantaged? Oh, okay. Well, let me step back then. Okay, the reason so many people study neighborhood effects and the conceptual background behind all of Hendren's presentation and pretty much anything you've heard in the news media about neighborhoods and neighborhood poverty mattering, not all of it, but a lot of it, dates to 1987. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. To a book by William Julius Wilson, who was a professor here at the University of Chicago for many years, called The Tool of Disadvantaged, in which he argued, he made the proposition that, he made a bunch of propositions, we're going to cover a couple of them, but the most relevant for now is that concentrated poverty affects people's life chances independently of their individual poverty. At this point, that seems obvious, but the truth is, in 1987, that was actually a pretty radical proposition, at least that systematically articulated. The idea was, it's not just that being poor makes your life worse, it's separately, or in addition to that fact, living around other poor people. In other words, living in a poor neighborhood. It distinguished neighborhood poverty from individual poverty and proposed that neighborhood poverty by itself also affected your life chances. This was an extremely important proposition, and many people around the same time advocated some version of that proposition. It is part of why we launched the Moving to Opportunity experiments, which you probably heard about yesterday or this morning. And it is why so many people, like Jens Ludwig here at the Urban Crime Lab and so on, have spent so many years trying to study whether neighborhood poverty actually affects people's life chances, and it's not all the obvious things like selection into poor neighborhoods, et cetera, all the things that you actually already know about. So this book is actually pretty important. It turns out that Wilson, whose office was right there, argued that many of the central theoretical arguments of this book were inspired by his travels in the inner city neighborhoods of the city of Chicago. Bill just literally got into his car and drove south. And the neighborhood's just south of here, literally. So we're on 57th Street. If you just go to 61st Street, you're in Woodlawn. And you look around and you see what Wilson saw. And these were neighborhoods that had lost tons of people and tons of middle-class people, mostly African Americans, but middle-class African Americans. And as they left and highly poor people stayed, what resulted was, he argued, a concentration of poor people in low-income neighborhoods. Notice that as that happened, there was also depopulation, right? So the concentration came about because the neighborhood lost people. And this inspired his thinking about this question. What he saw was something, this is a picture of Woodlawn. If you haven't looked around Woodlawn, there are many parts of Woodlawn that still look like this. Just to give you a sense of what he was talking. So he saw this, and he said, how is this going to affect people's life chances? If you haven't read The Tool Disadvantaged, please go and read The Tool Disadvantaged. You ought to read The Tool Disadvantaged. It's a book that has a ton of ideas, powerful ideas. It only has a little bit of evidence for them. But what's interesting is that so many of them turned out to be right. I mean, it's really kind of an incredible feat. OK, so Bill's ideas, which informed a lot of what we've read since then, were based on his fieldwork. I don't know if you know the work of Mary Jo Bain and Paul Jargowski, but if you didn't, you should. You might be familiar with the idea that people have a threshold of 40% poor for defining a poor neighborhood. There are lots of ways of defining poor neighborhoods, obviously, and there's lots of ways of thinking about it. You can think in terms of distributions. You can think about within-city distributions. You can think about national distributions. There's a whole bunch of ways. For a long time, a lot of scholars had agreed with the idea that a 40% threshold was probably a pretty good threshold. Mary Jo Bain and Paul Jargowski, both demographers. So you know them, plausibly. OK, yeah, OK. How quickly they forget. Anyway, these are extremely important works. OK. So, but here's what's great about Mary Jo Bain and Paul Jargowski. They were demographers, but what they did is they got into their cars, and they went to Baltimore, Boston, Detroit, Little Rock, Memphis, Omaha, Philadelphia, San Antonio, and other cities. Literally, they just drove around with their maps. There was no Google Maps at the time. And they found that the 40% criterion, meaning the threshold at 40%, when the tracks were about 40%, they looked like ghettos. They looked like what we tend to think about when we intuit in our papers, neighborhood poverty affecting people's life chances. And based on that fieldwork, they said, you know what? Actually, let's set the 40% threshold because we have some validation, quote-unquote validation, based on some visits to the field, that the 40% criterion is capturing a lot of what we worry about when we worry about neighborhoods. And what they saw were places like this. This is Baltimore. And again, you see the signs of depopulation that we saw in Woodlawn, except in a different kind of context, but very similar. This is another of the cities they visited, Philadelphia. This is North Philadelphia. Very similar signs of depopulation, right? So this is actually good, because what happens is, rather than just relying on the census maps, at least we have some inkling of what it is that we talk about when we talk about a neighborhood that's 40% poor. When you saw those beautiful models that you probably saw this morning or yesterday, you have some inkling about what it is scientifically that we're observing, that we're referring to when we're reporting that, you know, the younger you are when you move into a poor neighborhood, the worse your life chances are, et cetera. Loic Vacant, who's another, I'm sure you don't know who he is. Anyway, Loic Vacant is a sociologist, and he's an ethnographer. He's at Bergen. He's a very smart guy, very interesting ethnographer. He was in the 80s and in the 90s a graduate student at the University of Chicago, right here in the sociology department. And he did field work for his dissertation in the south side of Chicago in 87 to 91. And this is how he describes what he said. He said, look, walk down 63rd Street in Woodlawn, literally 6 blocks from here, on the south side of Chicago, along what used to be one of the city's most vibrant and commercial strips, and you will discover a lunar landscape. He's very dramatic. Lunar landscape, right? There's nothing there. It's like barren, replicated across the black ghettos of the United States. He argued the contemporary ghetto has been afflicted by a steady depopulation. He saw exactly the same thing Wilson saw, which is all these people leaving. You see evidence of that here, right? Clearly, there were people in these places once before, right? And now they're empty, boarded up. Same here. you can see the physical manifestations of the depopulation that you can document by going to the US Census. Now, I'd like to note that Vacantes did his fieldwork in the south side of Chicago, but he argued that that lunar landscape was replicated across the black ghettos of the United States. He didn't do research across the black ghettos in the United States. He did research in the south side of Chicago. But what's interesting is, because our images were a couple of it. Have you seen The Wire? I'm not going to tell Bill Wilson that more people have seen The Wire than read his book. Inequality Group. Okay. If you've seen The Wire, you recognize these photos. And what's interesting is we recognize The Wire. It's actually quite easy to make the leap from field observation to what we've seen in The Wire to this is what the ghetto looks like. But what's interesting about that is, really, The Wire is not a study of the black ghetto. The Wire is a study of Baltimore. Just as Vacantes' study was a study of the south side of Chicago, not even the west side. And taking qualitative work seriously means limiting our beliefs about what we're reading to what we have documented is warranted to believe based on what we've seen. And this is actually going to matter. There's another, I promise you, important book by Eric Klinenberg, who's another sociologist at Berkeley, called Heat Wave. You probably have heard of Eric. He writes for The New Yorker a lot now. He booked the, Aziz Ansari, Aziz, how do you say it? Ansari or Ansaria? Aziz Ansari, he wrote a book on romance, modern romance, and relationships. He went around. He wrote the book with a sociologist. That sociologist is Eric Klinenberg. I won't tell Eric Klinenberg that you know more about his book Aziz than his classic ethnography, Heat Wave. He studied the 1995 Chicago heat wave, and he spent a lot of time in the poor neighborhoods of Chicago, and this time not just in the south side, but also on the west side. And this is what he describes. Again, taking ethnographic work seriously, he describes spaces eerily devoid of human traffic. Streets such as 16th Street, Ogden Avenue, and Roosevelt Road, so this is on the west side, right? If you don't know Chicago, this is the west side of Chicago, feel ghostly. Again, lunar landscape, ghostly, depopulated, with decaying buildings, boarded windows, empty lots, closed shops, liquor stores, and small fast food joints. So again, very consistent picture. Now here's what's interesting though. These are ethnographers who were studying a handful of cities. I literally listed to you the 8 or 9 cities that Mary Jo Bain and Paul Dorgowski visited on which we developed that criterion. I just showed you the many core important ethnographies by Loic Vacantes, Eric Klinenberg. You might be familiar with Sudhir Venkatesh's study, American Project. Okay, do you know who Steve Levitt is? Okay, remember a book, Freakonomics? Okay, remember in that book there's a paper on why drug dealers still live with their mothers? There was something catchy like that? They only made minimum wage? No? Okay, I'm going to recommend that you read the papers that informed Levitt's book, Freakonomics. You don't need to read Freakonomics. I'm sure he would agree. Anyway, this is a book written with Sudhir Venkatesh, who studied the housing projects here in Chicago on the Robert Taylor homes, which used to be right here on State Street between 35th Street and 45th Street. The book American Project turned out to be an extremely important book for informing us, again, what poor neighborhoods look like. That neighborhood is also in Chicago. So we've studied a couple of cities very well. But we actually don't know, or have not studied the extent to which those cities were actually representative in the late 80s and early 1990s. And we certainly don't know whether they're representative now, 25 years later. In fact, the fact that we are still referencing these books today, with a couple of exceptions, the book in Philadelphia I mentioned, the book in Milwaukee, a couple others, should give us reason to pause. Why? Because to the extent that those neighborhoods were representative then but are not now, then our picture about what's happening in poor neighborhoods and about what they matter is informed by bad data or irrelevant data. And to the extent that they were not even representative then we really screwed up because we've been spending 20 to 30 years theorizing what's happening in poor neighborhoods on the basis of bad data. And I'm going to share a couple of concrete ways in which actually this matters. In other words, taking ethnography seriously as data is important. I have a couple more photos because I just think of this. This is Camilo Jose Vergara, who is an awesome photographer. And if you care about neighborhoods, you should study his work. Camilo has been studying and photographing the same neighborhoods, the same blocks in those neighborhoods, the same storefronts in those neighborhoods since the 1970s. He has an extraordinarily rich photographic detail. He's not a sociologist, but again, an extraordinarily rich detail of what's happened to many neighborhoods over the last 30 to 40 years. His work is archived now in the National Congress. He has a bunch of awards and stuff. This is a photo he took in the Bronx in the 1980s. Again, very similar signs of depopulation, but again, that was the 1980s. Here's a photo of East St. Louis, again, to show you that it's not, people who were studying these neighborhoods were not crazy to study them. Okay, so we're going to focus on depopulation and ask those two questions about depopulation. Were those cities, those neighborhoods that we saw then, representative at the time, and are they representative now? Why depopulation? There are lots of reasons. How about I skip the part where I try to justify it, because I think it's pretty self-evident that a lot of things are going to be hard in a place like this for a bunch of reasons. You're going to walk less outside, and so there's evidence, for example, that it has an impact on health, all else being equal. Again, it's not an experiment, but it's pretty good associational evidence. It's not surprising that it's going to be pretty hard. If you're going to set up a business, you're going to have a much harder time setting it up in a place like this and in a place that has a much higher population profile. Just literally, you're going to have fewer customers with respect to foot traffic. If you are the pastor of a church and you want a good congregation, there's tons of evidence that as the middle class left, the middle class often constituted the leadership in many of the churches, so the churches lost people, so neighborhood institutions end up being hard to sustain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to ask that you give me this one, not because I think just because it's not that important to make this case. I think it's pretty self-evident. Jane Jacobs made the same point, Eyes on the Street. This is back in the 60s. If you haven't read Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, you pretty much should. Okay, so the question is about representative. How are they going to think about this? I'm going to use literally U.S. Census data in homage to the sole demographer in the room. And these are data which are normalized, meaning I can compare the tracts across space. I think you all know about how tracts change. Tracts change a lot over time. We add more tracts because there's more people. If too many people move to a space, the census will split up a tract into two to make it easier to count. Tracts typically have about 3,000 people in them. As a result, if you want to compare the same places across time, you have to take data in which you take tracts from a particular decade. In this particular case, is the 2010 census tract data, and just retrace the 2000 and 1990 and 1980 and 1970 data to match the 2010. Literally retrace the geography, right? And then just match the people to that geography. So what that means is that when I say a poor neighborhood in 1990, what I mean is a space that has the geographic profile of 2010 and was poor in 1990, and it's going to be different from if you took the actual 1990 census and did the same thing. It's not going to actually make very much of a difference, but it's an important technical issue that somebody's going to bring up that matters. In other words, the data are comparable across time. Okay. We're just going to call a neighborhood depopulated if at time 1, that neighborhood in that particular city has a population less than some k factor of that same space at some earlier time. To start, that k factor is going to be 1. So we're going to call a neighborhood depopulated if it's lost any person. If literally lost one person, we're going to call it depopulated. But then we're going to change that. We're going to change that k to 0.9, to 0.8, to 0.7 to look at degrees of depopulation. Very straightforward. That earlier time point, we're going to make that earlier time point 1 decade earlier and then 2 decades earlier. That's it. And so the idea is, do you have fewer people than you had 2 decades earlier? How many fewer people? And the 2 years we're going to worry about are the year 1990 and the year 2010. So we're going to see how many neighborhoods were depopulated in 1990, how many neighborhoods were depopulated in 2010. That's it. That is a simple, as you've noticed, completely descriptive exercise. Notice also that we're not looking prospectively at change. That is also worthwhile. That's just not what we're doing in this paper. What we're doing in this paper is we're taking ethnographic data seriously as ethnography, and we're conducting a thought experiment. The idea is this. So I just complained that Loic Vacant only went to the south side of Chicago, but made a huge statement about black ghettos across the United States. Well, what we're going to do is the following. Remember, he was in the field from 1987 to 1991. We're going to take the year 1990 and say, let's suppose that Loic could go to every single city of the top 100 cities in the country and every single poor neighborhood in those cities, would he see that the poor neighborhoods are depopulated? That's it. And then suppose that it's 2010 and the new young graduate student in the department who wants to do an ethnography could do the same thing. Would he see depopulation at the same rate? First question. Second, would it depend more or less on which city he picked? Yeah? I mentioned The Wire. I should say, by the way, I really like The Wire. In fact, the reason I saw The Wire is because Bill Wilson, who loves The Wire because of its, in his mind, accurate representation of the ghetto, he literally got angry when I told him I had never seen The Wire. Bill, I don't have cable. Well, then you get the DVD, Mario, and then you watch the... I was like, okay, I'm going to watch The Wire. It's a good show. But many people believe it is a good show. In fact, there are multiple courses in many universities based on The Wire as a television show. He actually taught one of them at Harvard with the undergrads. And the reason is, repeatedly, The Wire was produced by a journalist. I forget his name, but a journalist. Simon, thank you, who had been a journalist in Baltimore for many years. And frankly, it shows. It's a spectacular show. Part of what I love about this is actually not a photo from The Wire. This is just a photo of a street in Baltimore. And yet, if you've seen The Wire, this seems really familiar. And what is also beautiful about it is it's also familiar if you've seen the photos that I just showed you of the south side of Chicago. The very similar picture of the population. In this case, it's row houses, boarded up buildings, front stoops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. OK, well, here's the answer. OK, so this is the proportion of poor tracts that had experienced population loss or gain when compared to the same tracts population 2 decades earlier. OK? This is for the year 1990. What you're seeing here is a simple heat map that has 100 lines, one for each. Don't worry, I'll explain everything. It's going to be very clear in a second. It has 100 lines, for each city, sorted by size. So New York City, the largest city, is at the very top, then Los Angeles and Chicago, et cetera, all the way down to Greenville, South Carolina. OK, that's it. And what you're seeing in dark is the proportion of all poor neighborhoods in that city that had lost population when compared to 1970, or had gained population when compared to 1970. That's it. Yeah?
Do you make an attempt to control for the entire city depopulating? So, like, I'm from St. Louis, and they made a huge deal a few years ago because at the decennial census, they actually gained people that lived in the city of St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously not going to, that's not necessarily just the poor neighborhoods of St. Louis, that's the city as a whole. So do you make an attempt to control for
that? Is an excellent question. That is an excellent question. What I'd like to do is pause that question. Notice 2 things. Notice you said the right thing, which is, have you controlled for the size of the city? That language, which everybody uses, is a language in which we're thinking about, well, a kind of an experiment, right? When you're controlling for something, I know that's not how you think about it anymore, but this is where the language came from. When you're controlling for a variable in a regression, what you're doing is trying to approximate the idea of a controlled experiment, making the 2 things you're comparing as comparable as possible. I think that's good. But part of the reason I am deliberately not showing you regression is I'm forcing us to think strictly about what this actually tells us. Remember, I began by saying ethnographic evidence is important because it paints the picture we have in our minds. I'd like to think of the ethnographic evidence as evidence. So what we're doing here is literally doing the experiment. I'm that young graduate student, and rather than just going to the south side of Chicago, I'm going to every poor neighborhood, literally every single poor neighborhood in the city. And I'm reporting what I saw. Notice that the idea of controlling is actually 1 step removed because I'm now making inferences about causes and effects. At this point, I'm just saying, what do you see? And what I'm showing you here, which is interesting, is that pretty much in 1990, wherever you go, you're going to see depopulated neighborhoods. The darkness, so if it's perfectly black, that means 100% of the poor neighborhoods are in that category. And if it's perfectly white, it means 100% of the poor neighborhoods are in the other category. What precisely because of what you said, what should have happened is, and if it had not been the case that depopulation happened, what should happen is that in 1990, literally there are just more people in the country than in 1970. So everything should be on this, right? Everything should be on this side of the heat map, right? Just mere population growth. The country got a lot bigger over those 2 decades. And what we're seeing here is you go to the ground and what you're going to see is, yep, pretty much what all of those photos said. What's interesting is some of the exceptions. That first white one, the second one at the top, that's Los Angeles. That's actually interesting because that means if UCLA had a better sociology department with more ethnographers, we might have had different ideas about what poor neighborhoods look like. It's kind of interesting. Notice Los Angeles was not one of the cities that Mary Jo Bain and Paul Dorogasky studied. They said it wasn't part of the picture. But okay, at the time we could say, you know what, Los Angeles, notice San Diego is also there. Those are kind of exceptions. I'm not making any causal claims because there are no causal claims to be made. I'm just saying, here's what would happen if you would see it. Yeah?
So the definition of poor neighborhood, is it that 40% threshold?
Yep.
But then this doesn't tell us necessarily about if there's just more poor neighborhoods or less poor neighborhoods across time also, right?
Correct. And this is why I know I was a little bit slow in describing the formula. That was part of the reason why. You're absolutely right. So we just went to 1990, and we counted all neighborhoods. We went to all neighborhoods that were poor in 1990, and we said, that same space, did it have more people or fewer people back then? That's it.
So these are the poor neighborhoods in 1990.
Correct. These are the 1990 poor neighborhoods. Neighborhoods observed in 1990. Yes?
So can we explain that? Some sort of gentrification of the neighborhood? So the people left on the 90s, sorry, in the 80s, and then also in the 90s, and then the space was there already, so just people jump in, and that's where we see this pattern of changing colors all the time.
Oh, let me clarify. That's a great question. This is not a change over time. Both of these are 1990. This is the proportion that lost, the proportion of poor neighborhood that lost people, the proportion that gained people. And the reason I'm showing you, and I'm being very, I know I'm being slow. I know, it's late. It's for you and for me. I woke up very early to get here this morning. This is what happens if you do the same thing in 2010. You're an ethnographer. Remember the thought experiment. This is actually quite important. You're an ethnographer, and you're really ambitious, and you have unlimited funding, and you go to every single neighborhood that is poor in 2010. What do you see? Well, the first thing you see is a lot more heterogeneity. The second thing you see is a lot less depopulation. Let me walk you through it a little bit. I know it's a little strange. So take that, you see the third line up there? The third line is Chicago. See on the left, in the left panel, the left heat map, the third line here, oh, actually I have a little pointer, maybe? Yeah, there it is. The third, let's see how, there it is. The third line, you see how it's dark on the left? That means almost all poor neighborhoods in Chicago in 1990 were depopulated. And if you go to the same thing and you do it now, 2010, it's still the case that in Chicago, almost all poor neighborhoods are depopulated. So when if Loic came back, he'd be like, well, yeah, I told you, because he got it exactly right. Yes?
Have you checked any correlation with demography? Okay. Have you seen any correlation with immigrants, like cities? Because I see a lot of cities in California. And
yes. That is as good a question as this question. Great question. And it's also a question about relationships and about what caused what. But I'm actually going to pause on that question because, and I'm going to answer, I promise I'm going to answer it, both of them. I will answer it. But I want to pause on that question because precisely what you're both doing, which is the right thing, all of you are doing, which is getting to the problems for making too strong inferences from just looking at what happened descriptively. However, I would like to posit to you that we haven't been clear on the very strong implications of a very simple description. Because I just told you that if you went to Chicago and followed the long-standing tradition of the Great Chicago School of Sociology, which in sociology is about as influential as in economics, the graduate school, the Chicago School of Economics is, if you want to think about it that way. You would spend the whole time thinking that the theories we've always had about poor neighborhoods still work, because we still know what poor neighborhoods look like. But look here. Suppose that instead you went to the many cities, for example, Boston, where I wrote my dissertation, by the way, which is the reason I came up with this question, by the way, because I was like, depopulation, what are you guys talking about? Well, because in Boston, this is what I saw. It's like, there's a ton of people here. Social isolation? That doesn't even make any sense. Well, now I know why it makes sense, because this is what they saw, and this is what their graduate students saw. Chicago. You see? In other words, there's a very strong idea about what poor neighborhoods are based on a couple of cities. I'm going to show you a lot more in a lot more detail. I just want to show you a couple of other things before we keep going. Yes?
So there's like a dynamic going on. So first they get depopulated, but then there's already low density. But then there is no more there to leave, right? So it's kind of, one is a flow, but then if it stays depopulated, we wouldn't see it in the data, but it's still low density area.
Absolutely. In fact, one way to think, absolutely, and I'm also going to show you, this is related to both of these questions. A different way of saying what you're saying is that Chicago actually, to the graduate students, looks worse than it did to the advisors because it's continued depopulating. Yes? I'm going to show, no?
There is kind of a flow and stop.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I didn't think I said anything controversial, yeah? So this is saying that in 2010, the majority of the poor neighborhoods in Chicago had fewer people than they did in 1990. Well, I'm just pointing to Chicago to start, than they did in 1990. But in 1990, they already had fewer people than they did in 1970. The simple point is that if you're black on both sides, you've continued depopulating. If you're only black on the left but not on the right, it doesn't mean that now you're great. It could mean that you're stably depopulated. Yeah? That's it. That is, in fact, your point, yeah? Okay. Don't worry, we're going to get to it. But this is, we're going to get to it. Don't worry. Okay. What we did here is we did a version of the same thing, but in a little bit more detail that helps answer part of that question, which is we looked at continuous decades. So originally, we just compared 1990 to 1970. But you could have gained people in one decade and lost them in another. There was a lot of dynamism in that period, as you might, well, I was going to say you might remember. I'm not going to ask you how old you were, because that doesn't matter. I certainly remember, which tells you that I am a lot older than I thought I was. Okay, so on the left is, in 1990, the proportion of poor neighborhoods, same heat map, that had lost people for 2 decades in a row. They lost, and then they continued losing. In the middle, they lost in one decade but gained in the other, and it could be either. And on the right, this is a little bit, gets not the full answer, but it gets at your question. In the right, for 2 consecutive decades, they gained people. The average, I'm just going to tell you, and I don't think you'll be surprised, the average neighborhood in the country was in this column. Surprise, right? Because the country got bigger. These are absolute numbers. This basically tells us the same picture we saw a minute ago. Now here's what happens in 2010. Way more heterogeneity. This is just poor neighborhoods. Put differently, in 1990, you could study Chicago, you could study Baltimore, Philadelphia, and get away with making an inference about the average American poor neighborhood. In 2010, you cannot. In fact, in 2010, if you go to Chicago, you're making the wrong inference about what's happening in poor neighborhoods in America. With respect to depopulation, we haven't talked about everything else. But what is more, think about what this means for how we interpret the results of the beautiful experiments. If all we have in our imagination to inform the intuition to depict what's in the black box, which is what we do, or all we have is a series of limited ethnographies that we don't see as data to examine critically, but we just see as this is what poor neighborhoods are like, if we continue believing what we're reading in the ethnographies in Chicago, and in the shows like Wire, we're actually going to get the wrong picture. And here, I'm going to show you so that you don't think that I'm making this up. Okay, so here, the dark one, that's Chicago. Baltimore is impossible to see, but it is, there's Baltimore. You see Baltimore? Baltimore's right there, just like Chicago. And Baltimore, of course, at both time periods, there's Baltimore right there, just like Chicago. I am not surprised at all that Bill Wilson loves Baltimore and sees it as highly indicative of what happens in poor neighborhoods, because it so happens that Baltimore is very much like Chicago, both of which are unlike most poor neighborhoods today. Yes?
Density alone instead of population, because especially in terms of the implications that you brought up, as far as like businesses being supported or their organizations present in the neighborhood, I would expect this would be a different picture if we were just looking at like density per square mile as opposed to decline in population over time. Like we still might see much more populated neighborhoods compared to other cities, even if that city had.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So part of what I skipped over in the evidence part is that there's actually quite a bit of evidence of the impact specifically of depopulation, which is part of why we focused on it. In fact, we first began by looking at just population density, but part of the reason it doesn't actually work is that, well, there's some economists in the room, it's equilibrium. And so, for example, Sunnyside, Texas, anybody from Houston? You know Sunnyside? Ah, that's why you asked this question. Awesome. Totally paid you to ask this question. I was going to show you pictures of Sunnyside, but I didn't. So I'm doing research in 3 poor neighborhoods, like field research, that are that have exactly the same poverty rate, same unemployment rate, same proportion African American, same rate of dependency, quote unquote. One of them is Sunnyside in Houston, one of them is Harlem in New York, and one of them is Woodlawn here in Chicago. The population density in central Harlem, the part of Harlem that's still poor, not the gentrifying outliers, but literally where the Harlem Children's Zone is, depending on which tract you pick, can be, for the tracts we're looking at, it's about 80,000 people per square mile. I'm going to show you in a minute. In Sunnyside, it's about 6,000 people per square mile. So 86. It turns out Sunnyside has been stably low population for a long time. In Woodlawn, it's 12,000 per square mile, but it used to be as many as 25 or 30,000 per square mile. And so whereas Sunnyside has fewer people per square mile than Woodlawn, the population in Sunnyside has been stable, whereas in Woodlawn it's been decaying. As a result, Sunnyside looks rural, not depopulated. So the pictures I showed you with the boarded up buildings, et cetera, that's not actually what Sunnyside looks like because there was never a population there in the decay. And it turns out there's evidence, how good it is another story. Another story, evidence that the depopulation itself, independently of its population density, affects the willingness of businesses to come in, the sense to which people feel safe in the neighborhood, in part because sort of institutions that have been around in a place that has been rural for a long time end up being pretty stable. Anyway, that's a little bit of a long answer, but that's the reason we focus on depopulation. However, if you'd like to do a study in which you focus on population density, particularly one in which you do fieldwork, I think that would be great. But I want to keep going, just briefly, to show you that actually the cities kind of matter. The cities we're actually picking to do our fieldwork kind of matter, and thinking about our fieldwork effectively kind of matters. I'm going to show you a little bit more so that we don't run out of time. Although I'm already realizing that that's not really an attainable goal. Here's the same data on a map that might help you visualize the data a little bit better. So that's 1990, that's 2010, and these were looking at decades of continuous depopulation. So 2 decades in a row, you lost people, right? So basically, it's the left panel in each of the 2 heat maps put up on the wall. And what you're seeing is that in 1990, the California cities, again, it's the darker the circle, the greater the proportion of poor neighborhoods that are depopulated. That's all it means. Okay, in 1990, well, you see that California cities were kind of exceptions. And so in 1990, if you went to the northeastern cities and you made some blanket statement, you were kind of okay. You should have added, except for the cities in California, by and large, but you're by and large okay. If you do the same thing in 2010, even look at in the northeast cluster, you're a lot more likely to make a big mistake. And just as importantly, if you use the ethnographies of 1990 to inform your theory about what's happening today, you're very likely to be wrong. Your intuition about what's happening in there, what's behind, what's in the black box, is very likely to be wrong. So I'm writing a paper version of this, and I'm happy to, if you send me an email, I'll send you the paper maybe in like a month. where I have a lot of regressions. There's no regressions here, but I'm going to show you some of the things that you would. I deliberately did not want to do that because part of what I'm hoping that you do is that you resist a little bit the natural temptation to which you're all going to be guided as you evolve over your graduate career, which is to run more and more complex models because it's easier to run them, because computers are more powerful, with bigger and bigger data, but increasingly removed from what's actually behind the data you're observing. And I'm being very slow on this on purpose because I'd like you to read your own data far more skeptically as a result of evidence that we already have and could have and should be paying more careful attention to. In other words, be paying attention to as we do with any other kind of evidence, taking them seriously as evidence, as opposed to, well, now we know that the ghetto is like this because Alice Goffman described this in Philadelphia, or I saw in The Wire that this happened, or 20 years ago, Loic saw the following thing. But anyway, this is a couple of the obvious questions that you're going to ask, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through them. Not because they don't matter, just because we don't have a ton of time. But they're going to capture some of the things that you're going to, what about immigration, population loss in the city as a whole? Some of the stuff is pretty standard. I'm going to show you really quickly, and then we're going to move on. But of course, I'll take any questions you want. Okay, these are the characteristics of the city, but the proportion, this is now, we're looking at the present. Okay, so what do you do today? This is the characteristics of the city by the proportion of poor neighborhoods that were continuously depopulated in 2010, meaning by the proportion of poor neighborhoods that in 2010 had experienced 2 decades of any population loss, consecutively. And what you're seeing here, percent black, percent unemployed, percent poor, percent foreign born. There is no surprise here. The big thing to notice is that the more African Americans there are in a city, the greater the proportion of poor neighborhoods in the city that are going to be depopulated neighborhoods. Meaning if you're that ethnographer and you pick a city that is highly African American, you're probably going to pick a city that's not an outlier, but that's at the very, very top of the income distribution. And it turns out that a lot of the cities that we want to study because we think they have the real ghetto are like this. Well, they don't actually have the real ghetto. They have the unique ghettos. They just seem like they have the real ghettos because they're the ghettos we always see on television and the ethnographies. In fact, if you think back to the last couple of years and the rise you saw, St. Louis, the police violence-related unrest, St. Louis, Baltimore, Chicago, some of the violence, a little bit in Philadelphia. Many of these are, Michael Brown and all of the cities that you're familiar with from the Black Lives Matter online movement, it turns out that they're actually almost all here. I'm going to show you that in a minute. At the same time, if you go to a neighborhood that has a lot of immigrants, sorry, a city that has a lot of immigrants, like Los Angeles, you're likely seeing a different kind of weird neighborhood. But what's really interesting, sometimes when I talk about this stuff, inevitably a graduate student in sociology and anthropology will come to me and say, well, I'm doing I'm doing a study in San Diego, but San Diego poor neighborhoods aren't really representative because of blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, they are no less representative than the ones in Chicago. It's just that in our public imagination about what a poor neighborhood is, we've actually relied on a couple of pictures that are actually quite compelling. There's more. It's obvious that one can do something far more sophisticated with this. Yes?
So this increase in the proportion of black populations that non-black are the ones that...
So I want to clarify. This is just 2010. And all we're saying is you're the ethnographer, and you come to your professor and you say, hey, I want to pick a city to do my because I only have 1 year to do my ethnography. I got to pick one city. How do I pick the poor neighborhood? I was like, well, here's some data that could help you. If you pick this one, Chicago's actually very close to this. You're going to find a neighborhood you're going to find a city in which the poor neighborhoods tend to be far more depopulated than average. This is the way we're thinking about this. In other words, this is an exercise in 2010. It's not an exercise about a change over time. However, tell me if I don't answer your question right now, but please tell me. This is what happens if we look at change over time, which I think is ultimately your question, right? In other words, your question was about if people are getting pushed out?
The
The cities in which the poor neighborhoods were more depopulated.
Yes. So,
But not necessarily the cities that themselves lost more people. The city could have gained people, but the poor neighborhoods in there could have lost people. Totally plausible. Because again, I know it's like, well, why do we do this? Let's just skip to the regression. Because I think you need to know what's in your data. Yeah? I think you really need to know what's in your data. We spent, there is a paper. The paper, it's in about a month. You send me an email if you want to read the actual paper. I'll send you the paper with regressions and all the beautiful things you want. We spent a year, more like a year and a half, cleaning and figuring out what was happening before we literally Stata did not see the command reg. And I'm doing this on purpose. And I'm actually slowing down, and I'm repeating myself a little bit on purpose because it's late, and I want you to remember this. If you remember nothing else, understanding what's actually happening in your data is extremely essential because it affects what you infer from your beautiful model. Yeah?
I have two questions. Maybe you will provide answers later so we can ignore.
Yes.
So what happens, where do these people go when they leave their neighborhoods? Where do they move? Do they move within the same city or just another?
That's a great question also. And these guys have great questions. They're all important questions. And again, they're a little downstream, but I'm going to try to get at a little bit of them. So the importance of this exercise, and the reason I was slow at the beginning, is that there are poor neighborhoods today. A neighborhood can be poor today as a function of a whole bunch of different processes that happened over the last 20 years. For example, it's a neighborhood today that was also it's a poor neighborhood today that was also a poor neighborhood 20 years ago. It's a poor neighborhood today that was a middle class neighborhood 20 years ago, but the middle class left, leaving the poor people behind. It's a poor neighborhood today that was middle class before, but had a whole bunch of immigrants move in who were poor. All of those would be in the category of a poor neighborhood today. And all of those are in the category of the thing you might see if you're the ethnographer going to the neighborhood. Now, in answer to your question is really more about the dynamic issue, which we haven't addressed yet, and I addressed a little bit in the paper. I can tell you that in 1990, a great majority of in the 100 largest cities, a great majority of the neighborhoods that were poor became poor because they were once middle class, but racially segregated, and the black middle class left. There's very good evidence for this. It's a nice paper by Lincoln Killian, who is a demographer at Northwestern, actually. This is actually quite well, there are many others. Paul Jargowski also is quite well documented. In 2010, the story is more complicated.
And that leads me to another question. What made them leave in the first place? What happened? Like, was there some economic reforms?
Oh, I see. What was the shock? Are you trying to see whether you can find a natural experiment to identify? No, I'm just kidding. Which would be okay, but I really hope that wouldn't be the only reason you ask. So we're pretty sure about the answer in 1990. In fact, that was literally the argument of Bill Wilson's book. And actually, it's part of the presentation I'm going to show you in a minute. But so maybe I'll pause. But I can tell you that part of it was, and there's pretty good evidence about this, an economic restructuring of cities. Basically, cities through the first half of the 20th century and into the post-war period were places where things got built. They were places for manufacturing. And many large cities shifted from being places where literally cars were built, shoes, etc. Those factories went to the suburbs where land was cheaper, or to other countries where land and labor were cheaper. And as a result, a lot of people also left. Another part of the story is probably the riots in the late 60s and early 70s. Another part of the story is probably the civil rights movement gains, which gave African Americans who were middle class the ability to live in far more places than they could before, and so they moved to the suburbs. So it's a complex story that is pretty well documented for that period. For the 2010 period, it's a little more complicated, and I think we're still trying to make sense of it. Yeah.
So I understand that we need to take the data serious, and so if I'm not an economist and I have the Movement Opportunity Project, then I randomly sample a number of neighborhoods from this distribution.
Yeah.
And then I try to make balance checks with all the observables that I can find. Would that eliminate your concern of how I can judge?
let me step back.
I mean, I know there are dynamic effects, so I mean, still to take that into account.
Right, but let me step back. So let's go back. It's a great thought experiment. So you're running moving to opportunity. The first question is, which cities you pick? We pick cities based, I don't know this for sure, but we certainly appear to have picked cities based on the presence of economists in departments in those cities. Not just economists, there were some demographers involved too, a few sociologists as well. But you know what I'm saying? Like the researchers were there was a tradition.
The question is, what should we do?
So if your question is, am I better off picking a new 5 cities at random? I'm not sure. Why? Because at random, you could end up picking 5 cities. 5 is just 5. You could end up picking 5 cities that are all here, or 5 cities that are all here.
True. I mean, I need to have a sample size that is big enough.
Well, this is exactly, I think you're asking exactly the right questions. It's not an obvious answer. But notice, now we have to ask. We can't just pick 5, because our inferences are going to depend on which 5 they are. We pick at random and we end up with a screw. Look, we could say, well, instead of 5, let's do 20. Well, the moving to opportunity experiment, I think, costs like $70 million. You're not going to get an infinite number of cities, right? Randomization won't solve it. Or maybe, perhaps the Trump administration will decide that it's extremely important to invest in this, but in the event that that doesn't happen, we're going to have to make some decisions about how we're going to pick. And what I'd like to propose to you is, maybe you want to stratify. Maybe you just want to look at the really worst cases because they're the cases, as I'm going to show you in a minute, where a lot of the unrest has happened. But whatever it is, notice that all of a sudden, what you're inferring from your results is very different. And it's only very different because you took seriously the ethnographic evidence. In the absence of any of this, in the ignorance of all of this, you could very easily move happily around with your 5 studies and say, I got it. Yeah? And what I'm arguing is that that is actually wrong. It's unscientific. But let me move. I'm going to move quickly. This is a little more data. It's the same thing. And the questions are going to be obvious, and I'll show you the full paper. But this is a 2-decade change in city characteristics by the proportion of poor neighborhoods that are continuously depopulated. Again, same thing. But what you're seeing is, in this line, the percent change in the city population from 1990. So what you're seeing here is that for those cities, and yes, there were cities that in absolute numbers lost people between 1990 and 2010, those cities tend to have the most depopulated neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods, the most depopulated poor neighborhoods. Somebody asked this, there you go. Yeah? And the regression, which we ran, shows all of the obvious things, and many of the same stories. I did not want to do that. And those cities that gained lots of people, almost always because they had tons of immigrants, had poor neighborhoods that were extremely unlikely to be depopulated. There's other parts of the story, but those are the parts that are important. In other words, immigrants appear to have been protective of poor neighborhoods in the 1990s and early aughts. Appear. Turns out that I can tell you that it's more than that. We run the regression, fixed effects, all of the stuff. Is the story that you would imagine is present. Let's look at this a little more in detail. This is what happens if we change remember that K factor? So if it's any population loss, if the population in 2010 is 90% of that in 1990, if it's 80% of that in 1990, if it's 70% of that in 1990, and in addition, there were 2 consecutive decades of population loss. It should be 2 consecutive decades, but that's what it is. And what I want to point out to you broadly is this at the bottom. So as you can imagine, so if we just consider a depopulated neighborhood, one in which there was any loss, only, well, a decent number. In 34 of the 100 cities, most poor neighborhoods are depopulated. Yeah? But if you look at more severe forms of depopulation, it starts becoming actually quite rare. Even as much as 80, it's only a quarter of all cities. Now what's awesome about it is, so let's say we take that 80%, right? So literally your population today is 80% of what it was before. Here are the 10 largest cities among those 24 cities. In other words, among those unique 24 out of 100 cities. Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore, Warren, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Kansas City, Columbus, Detroit, and Milwaukee. And in case you were wondering, this is where Evicted was written. This is where the movie Detroit was filmed. This is where The Wire was filmed. It's also where the great new study by Kathy Eden that you've heard about and Stephanie DeLuca was conducted, and also the big longitudinal study by the Hopkins group. You would know, the Hopkins group who studies poor neighborhoods. Anyway, that was Baltimore as well. Riots, riots, riots. Chicago is where every neighborhood ethnography basically comes from, etc. The most prevalent and vivid picture that we have of poor neighborhoods is wrong for most cities. For most cities. It's quite accurate for a subset of cities that we keep studying and reporting on over and over. Oh, we have to take a break. But let me just finish this and then we'll take a break. Oh, but I didn't show you the second study. It doesn't matter. We'll take a break and then we'll get you the second study. But you had somebody had a question?
Yeah. I was just thinking this, I don't know if it's wrong, but this moving to opportunity project was not only in Chicago, it was also in Boston and New York, right?
Yes.
So that gives us like a little bit more picture than just this group, right?
It does. And you want to know something really beautiful? So the Moving to Opportunity study, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, was in Baltimore, Chicago, New York, Boston, and Los Angeles. Is that right? That's probably, I think that was right. What's awesome about it is that for some effects, for some outcomes, there's a nice paper by Jens Ludwig and Julia Burdick-Will. I think they were looking at cognitive development or cognitive test scores. There were only effects in Baltimore and Chicago. Isn't that great? I'm not making this up. If you send me an email, I will send you the study. And part of the reason I know is because we spent a lot of time talking about why. It turns out that Chicago neighborhoods and Baltimore poor neighborhoods are extremely violent. They're very young. It's not the only reason, but they tend to be, in other words, the average age of residents in poor neighborhoods in Chicago and Baltimore is lower than the national average for poor neighborhoods, which is strongly associated with violence because people age out of violent crime. And anyway, their inference, but it was total guess, because they hadn't done the field work. But you know, you can't do everything. But anyway, the guess was that the violence was a big part of the reason why there were strong effects on cognitive development in those two cities, but not the other three. For that, this was before the most recent set of studies. So it was not about mobility. It was, I'm pretty sure it was cognitive development or cognitive test or the math test, whatever the cognitive skills one was. I think that's right. You see? In other words, it's very plausible that the way we should read about the way we should interpret the Moving to Opportunity experiments is about five case studies for some outcomes, again, as 5 case studies in which 2 of them are consistent one way and 3 of them are consistent a different way. Notice I began by talking about the importance of understanding heterogeneity, not just across subpopulation, but also across treatment settings. That's essentially the point you just made, and I would agree completely. Yes?
The question that's occurring to me is just whether it's fruitful rather than saying we study poor neighborhoods and they have these characteristics like declining population. We instead say we're interested in studying neighborhoods of a certain type. They tend to be low income, depopulated, and more violent maybe.
Yeah.
That could still be an object of interest. But it sounds like what you're bringing out is that there are other objects that should have been of interest if people were really just concerned with poverty, if they weren't studying, and if they weren't explicit about what they were.
Yeah. So I think so I would agree with both points. First, I think the first set of studies is completely fine. It's good, in fact. In fact, part of the reason I focus on it, so I should say this. So I did my dissertation in a poor neighborhood in Boston, and then I moved to Princeton, and I lived in New York, and then I did field research in New York. And so as you can imagine, I spent a lot of my early career, I'm just going to show you real quick. So I graduated in 2001 and lived in New York from 01 to 05, 06, and then I came to Chicago. Okay, and then I came to Chicago in 06. But as you can imagine, Because I'd done my first project, where's Boston? Boston's not that big, so it's probably, there it is. So as you can imagine, because I did my first ethnography in Boston, and my second one in New York, but everything I was reading was based on research in Chicago, I was like, what the heck are you guys talking about? Just the theories didn't make it. Social isolation, the institution. I was like, I don't even understand what you're talking about. I don't see any of this stuff. Then I came to Chicago, and I was like, oh, I get it. And that's when I realized, essentially, that version of your question. The way we should have been thinking about this from the beginning is, at a minimum, we're interested in poor neighborhoods that happen to have highly depopulated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we wouldn't have been in the situation where we were making blanket statements and blanket inferences. And so now, 15 years later, we have better data. Notice we have better data, but our theories aren't any better. In other words, our theory about why. Okay, so we know that if you move, the earlier you move to a neighborhood that is in which, and I forget the particular disadvantage measure they used, is in the bottom quintile of the local distribution, the worse you're going to end up, et cetera, or vice, oh, actually, it's the other way. Right, the more in the top, the better you're going to do, et cetera. Okay, why? Did they have better schools? Is it greater population density? Is it weak? The why is thin. It's completely thin, right? And so I suspect, I would argue that it would have been a lot less thin had we done this from the beginning. And I would argue that no matter how big the data and how better, even if we, in addition to having the tax data, we also add the employment or arrest data or all of that stuff, all of which is wonderful, unless we do better fieldwork and we take the fieldwork data as data, rather than, oh, now we know how it all is, we're not actually going to get further scientifically in understanding why neighborhoods matter. What we have now is a really compelling association in which anything on the inside is a big black box. I think we need to understand the black box better. Okay, let me just show you a couple more things. And that was my alarm. That was not my phone ringing. It was time for a break. And we'll take a break, and I'll just skip. So this is really quickly. We looked at 2010, the severity. Somebody asked, I think you asked about this. The consecutive decades of population loss. So it's a similar thing. You go to a neighborhood in 2010, what are you seeing? And this is the proportion of all neighborhoods that would have experienced 4 consecutive decades of population loss. It's huge. And there are 17 cities in the country in which half, at least, of all poor neighborhoods fall in that category, 17 of the 100. And this is them. Chicago, St. Louis, I mean, literally it's the same thing, except that now instead of Milwaukee, it's Indianapolis and Jacksonville, and Kansas City is no longer there. Many of the same cities you have the same picture of. Many of the cities, what is actually quite powerful is, I started tracking the police brutality riots, and there are many of the same cities. Ferguson, okay. So heterogeneity has increased. We need to care about this, and we need to ask better questions. And what I'd like to ask you to think about, look, you're in graduate school, and in order to do well as an economist or a sociologist or a demographer or historian, you're going to have to get really good at assessing your kind of evidence. You have to. You won't get a job otherwise. But what I would like to also add is that unless you have a sensitivity about how different kinds of data also work, and a sensitivity towards which you address those different kinds of data as data, right? A history is not just a nice story, right? An ethnography is just a picturesque night read. Assess them as data. They will make you a better researcher in whatever field you are. That is what I would like to propose. Okay, so why don't we take a few minute breaks. I'm going to show you a little bit more data in which we'll look at now at one of those variables. I think somebody had mentioned a question about this, actual organizational density, like the things that you actually want in a neighborhood. And what I'm going to show you is that if you do this today and you pay attention to organizational density, you have even more reasons to realize we need better ethnographies in more different kinds of cities, and we need a better sensitivity to what's happening in those places. Okay? All right, why don't we take, so here's the thing. Why don't we proceed democratically? So it's 2:40. I have to leave at 3:55 to the car. Maybe 3:57, 3:58. I have to go. And so, we could take 15 minutes. instead of more? And that way, yes? I promise you, you see, it's not very taxing, not a lot of math to do, but I hope things that you're going to think about seriously. So why don't we come back at 6 minutes to 3. Hi. We are 3 minutes late. And I admit it's partly my fault, but it's time to get started. I hope you got some coffee. This is the lightning round. It's like, what are those dating things when you sit in the chair and then you get a new date every 5 minutes or something? This is like that, except it's data, not dating. No, it's not data. It's only a little bit of data. Okay, so we've talked about poverty, and I want to talk a little bit more about poverty, and I'm going to talk a little bit faster. And I'm only going to talk a little bit faster because there's some cool stuff that I want to show you that's really awesome, and we won't get to it unless I talk a little faster. But okay. So I've been saying, look, we gotta go do field work, and we have to. If you're not going to do field work yourself, which is fine, at least read field work and read it with the right kind of disposition in light of your own evidence. Okay. What I'm going to do is another version of that, where I'm going to argue that we have a bunch of theories about what's happened to poor neighborhoods over the last 40 years at this point. And most of those theories are kind of, something like pop macroeconomics or something. I don't know what to call it. But some ideas like, well, it's not just pop. There are actually serious economists involved as well. But the idea is like, well, this has happened to the United States economy. And because of that, this has happened to cities. And because of that, this has happened to poor neighborhoods. And because of that, it's really tough to live in a poor neighborhood. And some version of this is the way we've theorized the consequences of neighborhood poverty. What I'm going to argue is that there's a lot to be gained from, rather than doing that, beginning from the ground. Literally just going to a poor neighborhood and seeing what's going on here, and then making an inductive inference about what you think is happening, and then finding other places where you can, I'm going to use Bayesian language, update your priors based on new information. And then based on those other places, you update your priors again and get increasingly larger and larger data until you have a very different kind of picture about the relationship between what's happening in poor neighborhoods and what's happening in society as a whole. So that's it. And I'm going to show you a couple of different kinds of results. I am going to skip over, not skip, I don't think, but I'm going to go pretty quickly over some of them because the data have gotten so much better that we can do way cooler things. And I want to show you some of the way cooler things that we can do. This is joint work with a bunch of people, including some people at Microsoft Research who gave us the data, and a couple of old graduate students. Manduka worked with Raj and Hindred in one of those papers. Robert's great, and then other people. Okay, access. So the question, I'm going to begin with a very narrow question. Here the question is, how does concentrated poverty affect access to everyday resources? The idea is simple. You live in a poor neighborhood, your life is supposed to be worse. And it can be worse in a whole bunch of ways. And we've already talked about the fact that there's messy and not great theories about what those ways are. I'm going to just focus on one possible way, which is that being in a poor neighborhood, again, not just being poor, but living in a poor neighborhood, makes it harder for you to get a lot of things that you might want to get. That's it. For example, if I live in a poor neighborhood, sometimes I have to go to the bank. Maybe it's harder to go to a bank if you're living in a poor neighborhood than if you're not living in a poor neighborhood. That's what I mean about resources. It's a very straightforward question. This is not about cognitive development, about safety or any of that. Think about them as instrumental mechanisms as opposed to socialization mechanisms for which neighborhood poverty might make your life worse. What I'm going to show you is that we have ignored heterogeneity across cities, surprise, surprise, and that it is manifested in differences in access, specifically, across poor neighborhood. Okay, the standard account. I'm just going to say that you have to read this book. You just have to, because, and if you haven't, I am disappointed in your education, but you're still in it, which is great. And so I'm going to recommend that you read it. This is the book by Loïc Vacant that I mentioned a minute ago. if you were interested in. And this is Bill's later work. This is a citation classic. And it's the book that actually has defined how almost everybody, including all of your faculty who think about poor neighborhoods, have thought about what's happened to the country in the last 40 years with respect to neighborhood poverty. But the standard account is something like this. Beginning around the 1960s and 70s, cities shifted economically from places in which things were built to places in which services were provided. So there was a broad shift. This is not very controversial, from manufacturing-based economies to service-based economies in cities. Around the same time, beginning in the 1970s and through the 80s and into the early 90s, the middle class left cities, both white and black. This is also not controversial. It's well documented, and you all know it. It's a major part of the reason most of you grew up in suburbs. You're part of that same trend. Later, although this wasn't part of the same story, there was the increase in punitiveness for particularly drug offenses over the 1990s, which also affected cities, and it was again a large-scale secular trend, and the collapse of the credit markets that you all know about that began in 2008, that affected everybody. But the idea is to understand life in poor neighborhoods, you have to begin, according to the standard account, from what happened in the country as a whole. As a result of these major shifts, particularly the changes in the economy and the departure of the middle class, what happened was an increase in the concentration of poverty. I described this a minute ago. And I'm going to pause for one part because this might not be perfectly clear. The idea is that if you have a city in which there are a lot of factory jobs, if you're a low-skilled worker, you can still find work. Because it's actually quite easy to enter into a company and learn on the job. Into the factory, learn on the job. But the minute economies start shifting into more service-oriented economies, it becomes a lot harder to get by with not having even basic skills. So it's a lot easier to begin on the ground in a factory than it is to begin as, for example, a teller at a bank, or as a service provider in a barbershop, or whatever it is. This is a theory. And so when all of these jobs left, it became a lot harder for a lot of low-income, unskilled, particularly African-American males living in inner cities, to find jobs. Because it was harder for them to find jobs, it was less attractive for the women in the neighborhoods to marry them. And so this was the theory. And so the increase in unemployment was followed by a decrease in what people called eligible males, which resulted in a drop in marriage rates. But people kept having children because everybody in the country as a whole became less attuned to the stigma of having a kid out of birth. And as you all know, households in which there's one parent tend to be poorer than households in which there are two. And as a result of all of these things, what you had is a concentration of cities, of neighborhoods in a central city in which not only did the middle class leave, but the people who were left behind were, this is why it's called truly disadvantaged, were increasingly disadvantaged. So that's how you got poor neighborhoods. Places where lots of people were poor. And this idea then shifted into the proposition I offered at the beginning of the session, in which I said, now we started theorizing that living in a poor neighborhood, separately from your individual poverty, can make your life worse. Okay? That was it. That was the process. As you know, this was derived from research in the city of Chicago. William Julius Wilson is a name you know. Doug Massey is a name you should know also as a Chicago-based researcher. His book, American Apartheid, which you should read, had a huge impact in the 1990s in the Clinton administration. It was a demographic book in which the first few chapters, which are most powerful for many people, were stories of the many strong efforts that whites engaged in to prevent blacks from moving into their neighborhoods. Many of those stories were actually made right here in Chicago as well, where Doug Massey was a professor. Robert Sampson was the author of a book in 2012. You know this book? It's called Great American City. Great American City is the city of Chicago. It's a project based on a very influential survey called the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods that has been collecting data on Chicago people since the 1990s. Loic Vacant, I just talked to you about. Sudhir Venkatesh, he's the drug dealer guy. Gang Leader for a Day, that's the name of the book. You've seen that. Gang Leader for a Day? No? Okay. Gang Leader for a Day is like everywhere. It's like in an airport near you. Well, at least it was. Those books don't tend to last. Anyway, he did real research too. Anyway, lots of people based in Chicago. But what they talked about is that not only was there's a high depopulation, but this is the key, there was low organizational density. There was deinstitutionalization. When all those middle class people left, the churches, the grocery stores, the convenience stores, the supermarkets, all that stuff left with them. Wilson put it well, poverty in ghetto neighborhoods has sapped the vitality of local businesses and other institutions, fewer movie theaters, bowling alleys, restaurants, public parks, playgrounds, all that stuff gone. Here's Rosenfeld and Messner. These are demographers and criminologists who wrote a textbook that some of you might have read when you were undergrads if you took a criminology class. They interviewed people, which is great, and they interviewed a police officer in Chicago, and this is what the guy said, describing the neighborhood. Look, he says, do you see any hardware stores? Do you see any grocery stores, any restaurants, any bowling alleys? There's nothing here. Everything we take for granted, laundromat, cleaners, anything, it's just not here. Right? Same kind of picture. What I've done, remember I told you that I did research in Boston, and then I researched in New York, and I was like, what are you guys talking about? And then I moved to Chicago in 2006. One of my best experiences is I was taking the train. I lived downtown, and I took the train in, and I missed my stop within the first few months here. The stop from I don't know if you took it, but the train that stops at 59th Street from downtown, I was reading, and I just missed my stop. And it was an express train, and so I ended up on 120-something Street. And, you know, I had just come from New York City. And if you live in New York City, you know, or if you've lived in New York City, that New York City blocks are 20 blocks to a mile, okay? So I figured, 60 to 125, that's 45, 50 miles. That's nothing. I could have I'm early for my appointment. I will just walk back. No problem. Well, in Chicago, blocks are not 20 to a mile. They are 8 to a mile. Yeah, I'm going to let you do the math. And so I had a very interesting experience trying to get all the way to 59th from way over there. The first thing that happened is I was like, am I still in the city of Chicago? Because it felt rural. There were trees and there were empty lots. And I was like, where am I? But then I started walking, and then as I started the numbers very slowly changing, I started realizing, well, I better catch a cab. So in New York, if you want to catch a cab, this is the yellow cars that people used to take from one location to another before there was Uber and Lyft. And the way it worked is you needed a cab, you just went like that, and then it stopped, and then you got in, and then it took you where it needed to get you. And so I went like that, and there were no cabs anywhere. And I didn't have a cell phone because this was a time when I didn't think cell phones were that necessary. And I'm not a Luddite at all, but anyway. And so I started walking. Eventually I found one bus stop and I waited. And I could only tell it was a bus stop because there was a little sign, but there was nothing around me. Finally, a man came to the bus stop. And actually, all of this is relevant. I'm not just telling you a story. And the man, I asked him a question about when the bus is coming, and I could not understand what he was answering. And I could not understand him because he had the thickest Mississippi accent I'd ever heard. Not black English vernacular, Mississippi. It was all Mississippi. And then I asked him again, and then I read, just then I finally figured out, he told me the bus was going to be here in half an hour. So I just waited, or 20 minutes. It was a long time. I waited, got into this bus. There were a few people, and eventually there were more and more people. And eventually I started seeing one store. And then empty lots, boarded up buildings, and then another store. And one gas station. And I saw very few until I finally got to like 63rd, and then I walked over here. But we were struck by the fact that in that entire time, it took several hours to get back here, I did not see a single person who was not African American. Not the bus drivers, the teachers getting in, the nurses, the people on the street, the kids on the blocks. There was not a single individual who was not African American, nobody. And everybody had a Mississippi accent. And it turns out because So with the Great Migration, a lot of the people who came to Chicago, so in New York, a lot of people came from Virginia and the Carolinas. In Chicago, a lot of them came from Mississippi. And there had been so much segregation for so many years, still is, that you can hear Mississippi accents in the south side of Chicago. But that picture was completely right. It was, you could see exactly what they were talking about. There was social isolation, there was deinstitutionalization, there was nothing there, there was depopulation. There was I finally understood what all those guys were talking about. This was Woodlawn, and this is what it looked like. And I showed you this picture. One of the things I like about this photo is you can see again, right? There used to be stuff there. There used to be stuff there, but there no longer is. But here's the thing. Remember I told you I was also doing this in New York? This is a neighborhood that has exactly the same poverty rate. Literally, also 38% poor. I think it's 36 to 38 in both places. Almost entirely African American, the part that's still poor. I picked a photo with the Apollo because people don't believe that this is what Harlem looks like if they've not been to Harlem. It's highly dense. Aldo, Foot Locker, whatever that other thing is, a movie theater now there from Michigan, there's grocery stores everywhere. It's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite. Here's another shot, many of the same thing. Common up there in a little ad. I think that's Common because it's called Uncommon Classic. Common's a rapper from Chicago. But anyway, this is again Harlem. So the first thing I had was, how much of this is real? So if you look at them, actually they're quite different. First, look at persons per square mile. You see Central Harlem, about 85,000. Woodlawn, actually, yeah, the time I did it was even less, 9,000 per square mile. Completely different kinds of poor neighborhoods, completely different kinds. But here's this thing that we were in. So we did a census. We literally just counted. And what we were interested in is, again, what is it that if you're living in these places you're experiencing? Again, literally, my thought process, I'm going to proceed completely inductively as opposed to deductively. And I'm going to move into this neighborhood. And I'm going to say, OK, so I live here and I need a pharmacy. How hard is it to find one? How hard is it to find a restaurant? How hard is it to find a grocery store? How hard is it to find a gym? Right? Basic resources that everybody needs. Notice that I listed establishments per square mile. That was on purpose because the idea is literally I walk down the street, I need to find a gym. How hard is it to do this? And what you're seeing is that it's really hard in Woodlawn, but it's not that hard in Central Harlem, and they're equally poor. So the idea that neighborhood poverty produces the institutionalization doesn't make a lot of sense. Of course, I've already talked to you about population density, and so a lot of this has to be population density, but guess what? It's not just population density. This is the number of establishments per 100,000 people. Even on the per capita basis, Woodlawn is actually highly undersupplied. It's like somebody's losing money by not investing in putting in a damn pharmacy or a restaurant or a grocery store in Woodlawn. So that's just two neighborhoods. So this is where this began back in 2006, 7 or 8 after I got lost in the train. So I started getting data. At the time, the only thing you could get was zip code data from the, so data in which, data aggregated to the zip code level from the Department of Commerce. Some of you in economics have used these data before. This is basically, for all urban zip codes, the number of any kind of establishment for which the government has a record. And it's pretty good, except once you get to, places that have fewer than about 5 employees, then it doesn't get as good. And places that have, and I forget how they calculate this, but I think they have revenues of less than $10,000 a year, doesn't get as good. So some mom and pop shops are not going to be here, but by and large, it's pretty good data. OK, so the question I had was, well, is the deinstitutionalization that's supposed to happen as a result of neighborhood poverty real? Or is it just something that happened in Chicago? We already know that Chicago neighborhoods are unusually depopulated. But the fact that they're unusually depopulated doesn't have to mean that they're unusually deinstitutionalized. In other words, they could just have proportionate to their population size what you would expect in terms of the number of establishments. We know that compared to New York, that's not the case. But it's not as if New York City, which is the largest city in the country, is especially representative either. And so even though I went to the field and I saw Chicago and it smelled weird, and then I went to New York and I realized it was weird, my new prior is like, well, maybe New York itself is weird too, so we need national data. Yeah?
So when the density in Chicago is so small, then those people could all be poor, right? And 80,000 per square mile in New York, there could be a nice distribution of income. So then there are some people that can afford a gym, and that's why there's a gym. And then if the 9,000 per square mile in Chicago are all poor, there will be no gym.
So the data you saw in both neighborhoods, the poverty rate was between 36% and 38% poor, so just below the 40% threshold. So, right. So in both places, there are lots of people that are not poor. What you're saying is that it could be the case that in central Harlem, there could be lots of people who, in addition to not being poor, are also quite rich. This is a different way of saying what you're saying. In other words, that the distribution beyond the 40% threshold could be such that in New York, there are tons of people who support these places. I'm going to show you tons of evidence that suggests that that's probably not what's happening. It's a completely valid inference, but I think going back to what I was saying earlier, the first thing we need to do is look at what did these places actually look like. But secondly, and this is actually more important, remember what we're trying to do is trying to understand what the actual experience of living in a poor neighborhood is. So I'm me, and I have whatever my income is, but I'm going on this theory that living in a poor neighborhood affects my life in a particular way. So I'm going to enter a poor neighborhood. And in a poor neighborhood, whatever I see is a function of whatever I see. And so it could be that even though back when Mary Jo Bain and so on did their 40% threshold, and it made sense, it could be that today it doesn't make any sense for a number of reasons. And in a sense, one of the things you're offering is a possible reason. But the first thing we need to do is see whether, with respect to the institutionalization, the story is right. Meaning the first thing we need to do is to say, okay, is it actually the case that you can't find a grocery store and a convenience store in the average poor neighborhood in the country? In other words, is it actually the case that on a per capita basis, poor neighborhoods don't have a lot of the things that we think neighborhoods should have? Yeah?
Could we think of mobility or public transportation as a way to reduce or increase the amount of services that you get? Because in Harlem, you can actually move around the city, and in 30 minutes you can be downtown Manhattan to Harlem, but you were waiting 30 minutes for a bus.
Exactly.
So,
from a policy perspective, we sure could, but I think the first thing we need to do is to figure out whether we need to. Because notice, in Harlem, you can get everywhere. But in Harlem, you also don't have to. Because everything is already there. Yeah? You see what I'm saying? I mean, and it's a great question. I hope what I'm trying to say in multiple different ways is, if we're serious about understanding scientifically what's happening in these neighborhoods, we can't skip ahead beyond the simple basic facts that actually appear simple, but actually fundamental to how we're theorizing solutions and what actually affects people's lives and so on. And what I'm suggesting now is that if you begin from the ground, as I did, you get lost and you're like, oh my goodness, this is what they're talking about, that we should not ignore those questions. That if you go back to St. Louis or wherever it is, or Houston, and you see something weird, that's actually the place to start. Rather than what we tend to do, which is say, no, it's not like The Wire. This is not a real poor neighborhood. The real poor neighborhoods are not the real poor neighborhoods. Okay, yeah.
So whenever you were showing the business establishments, even per 100,000 people, and you saw there's a big discrepancy.
Yeah.
I wonder if that could be a supply side cost story. So I'm wondering if you had data on the number of property crimes in these areas. So maybe business owners don't want to open in a place like Woodlawn because they're afraid of being burglarized frequently, versus in Harlem, they don't have that fear, so they can open up more easily.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised actually if that is in fact the case. And I think in fact that is one great thing that you could do. At the same time, scientifically, it's unclear whether it's worth the trouble. Suppose I find that Woodlawn is just completely weird, there's no place like it. And it's like, why are we wasting time on that? Because it's not, well, we want to understand it for the sake of the people in Woodlawn, but scientifically, it's not part of the story of neighborhood effect. Or it could be that New York is just really weird. It is literally the single most dense city in the country. And also, I will just tell you this, no city has poor neighborhoods with greater population density than New York City. And so it, in fact, could be the case that those rosy figures are weird too. And what you're describing, in other words, that the Woodland story, even though it was weird with respect to population density, is actually quite common with respect to the prevalence of institutions. If that's the case, we don't actually have to spend a lot of time finding cool instruments for crime because it's the average story anyway, even in places where we know the crime is not very high. You see what I'm saying? So it's the extent to which you actually think about your data in a serious way is going to affect the quality of the knowledge you produce. By the time you're done with graduate schools, you're going to be doing very, very well the part that seems hardest, but in fact is easiest from a different perspective. You're going to be the kings and queens of finding clever instruments. You're going to be the queens of large-scale data mining. You're going to be the queens of, you name it, you're going to be able to do it. But I promise you, well, I would venture that there's going to be a big gap between whether you can do that and whether you're actually doing good science. Those are not actually the same thing. There are lots of great coders out there. I've worked with many of them. Half of the people there were civil engineers. They're masterful coders. That is actually not actually what makes good science. This is a big part of the reason why I'm doing this. And don't worry, if you love cool big data stuff, I'm going to show you something in a minute, but I'm slowing down because I don't want us to get away from thinking seriously about the data. Okay, so again, we're being good Bayesians. We went to one neighborhood in New York. We're like, what are you guys talking about? You guys are weird. Chicago. Then I went to Chicago. I was like, oh, I get it. I updated my priors. There's at least 2 different kinds of poor neighborhoods. Yeah? Then I went to the actual data for just these 2 neighborhoods, and I confirmed what I saw, right? Updated my priors again. I'm like, okay, actually, it was in fact the case that there is a big difference in both population, but also, most importantly, commercial density between these 2 places. And I said, okay, but these 2 places are weird. Let me go and look at the national data and update my priors again. And so this is what we're doing now. We're being good Bayesians, or we're trying to be good Bayesians here, okay? So this is the average number of establishments per 100,000 residents in the year 2000. So as you can tell, I did this before the year 2010. And this is the data for Chicago. And so what you're seeing here in bold, what you're seeing in bold is just a summation of everything beneath that. So what we call small day-to-day establishments, hardware stores, grocery stores, convenience stores, banks, pharmacies, the stuff that pretty much regardless of your income, you're going to kind of want to have around you, okay? And what you're seeing there, for example, hardware stores, so the average poor neighborhood in Chicago in the year 2000 had 3.5 hardware stores per 100,000 residents. So now you know, yeah? And it had 33 grocery stores per 100,000 residents, et cetera, on the list. And what you see, the 120 at the very, oh, where's the little thing? 120 at the very top. 120 at the very top. What you're seeing, that's just the summation. Literally, we just summed all this up. And the reason we did this is we're going to show you a bunch of data really fast, and we're just going to focus on the stuff in bold, okay? And I think I sent you a version of this. Maybe not. Okay, doesn't matter. And what you can see is that's the number. Here we looked at small medical, like clinics, doctor's offices, dentists, and so on. Small here means it has fewer than 20 employees. Okay, and what you're seeing here, there's 36 per 100,000 residents. Here we looked at, people talk about movie theaters, bowling alleys, recreational areas. That's what Wilson said. Well, is he right? Turns out, yeah, there's no movie theaters. 1/5 of one gym per 100,000 residents. So you can see it's not that hard to imagine there's going to be impacts on health. A little less than that in terms of bowling alleys. So, you can't even bowl alone because you can't bowl. And as you can see, that's the summation. Places where you can just socialize, like churches, cafeterias, cafes, bookstores, like literally just meeting people, about 98 per 100,000 residents, et cetera. Okay. Bottom here are large establishments, so supermarkets. You've heard about food deserts. That's the indicator. And yep, poor neighborhoods in Chicago are in fact food deserts. Food deserts. This is hardware stores. Always somebody asks about Home Depot. There it is. I'll tell you right now, there's no story. But if I didn't have this, somebody said, what about Home Depot? Well, there it is. I will tell you there's no story. That's hospitals. Okay, that's the city of Chicago. Okay, what happens when you compare poor neighborhoods in Chicago to poor neighborhoods in the average American city? And that's what you see. The average American city has not quite twice as much, but way more small day-to-day establishments. Not quite, but about 3 times as many small medical establishments. These are, again, the poor neighborhoods in the average American city. 10 times as many recreational establishments. More than twice as many small social establishments. No Home Depots. A few more grocery stores, but it's still consistent with actually the food desert story and hospitals. So we update again. Actually, Chicago was kind of weird. Yep.
But the effects are mostly driven by restaurants, right? So, like also there, and okay, there's something going on with religions. It's also in the previous slide. It was not grocery stores. It was mostly restaurants. It could be interesting.
In fact, indeed, it could. So there's several interesting aspects of this story. First, so we were talking about the restaurants were actually on they were here. So huge effect. But notice there's actually a pretty consistent difference, not in laundries, grooming centers, pretty consistent difference, pretty much regardless of establishment we look at. There's some heterogeneity there that in the third study that we can't do because we don't have time. I was going to show you just childcare centers, which I've studied in far more detail. I'm hoping that some of you would explore it. I would read this data as saying a lot of the story appears to be there, but certainly there's a consistent trend of more of almost everything in the poor neighborhood in the average city than in the poor neighborhood in Chicago. Except for Home Depots and the large hospitals and grocery stores. Chicago is still low on the distribution, but it's still not the same. So this is Chicago. Well, Chicago, as you know, is the third largest city in the country. What if you just compare Chicago to the largest cities in the country, like the 10 large ones? So not to like Cincinnati, but to like New York and Miami and LA and so on. Here's what you see. Still, the average city has more establishments than Chicago. Sorry, in the average of the 10 largest cities, there's more than in Chicago, more than in Chicago, more than in Chicago, more than in Chicago. No story, no story, no story. What if you just look at the Rust Belt cities, the ones that everybody says, okay, if nothing else, Chicago is the classic quintessential Rust Belt story. Nope. Chicago is weird when compared to the Rust Belt stories, when compared to the Rust Belt stories, when compared to the Rust Belt stories, when compared to the Rust Belt stories. No story, no story, no story. Yeah. Chicago is, in fact, weird. Chicago poor neighborhoods are, in fact, more deinstitutionalized on a per capita basis than average poor neighborhoods. It's just our bad luck that the University of Chicago has a great sociology department with a focus on ethnography. Because if it had been in literally UCLA or UT Austin or, frankly, even Columbia University, we would have had completely different ideas on an academic basis for at least the role of this one mechanism in neighborhood effects, the role of organizational capacity. There's a lot more, don't worry, this is just the basics. The obvious question, one of the many obvious questions, is that Chicago is a sprawled city. It could be that in Chicago, all neighborhoods have fewer of everything than in other cities, not just the poor neighborhoods. If you've driven around over the course of the last 5 days, you've seen it takes a while to get to places, and there are lots of big lots, and there's lots of big everything. And especially when compared to New York, for example, it's just simply not the case. In New York, you walk 1 mile, you see a bunch of everything. Here, you walk 1 mile, you don't see that much. You don't see that many people, but you also don't see that much. Well, here's literally just a difference in organizational density within city between poor and non-poor neighborhoods. And what literally, simple summation. And what you're seeing here is with respect to the small everyday establishments, so these are obviously the summation of the items we saw before. I didn't want you to think that I was pulling a fast one. There's all the data. This is a summation to make our lives easy. If the number is negative, that means there's fewer in the poor neighborhoods per capita, per 100,000 residents than the non-poor neighborhoods. What you're seeing here, about 66 fewer small day-to-day establishments in the poor neighborhoods than in the non-poor neighborhoods in the same city. Fewer small medical establishments, slightly more social service establishments, which is not surprising. They're social service establishments. They serve the poor often, okay? Fewer recreational establishments, fewer small social establishments, no Home Depot story, and fewer supermarkets, which is what we expect. Yes?
Quick question.
Yes?
How different are the same numbers for the rich neighborhoods? We have been focusing a lot on the poor neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But then the question is, are the rich different as well?
So this is one way, so I can give you one way of, This won't answer your story perfectly, but it'll get part of it. So this is rich minus, it's not rich. You mean not just the non-poor, but the actual rich ones.
Yeah, the actual rich.
Don't have.
Rich in Manhattan different than the rich in Chicago, or just to see.
I can answer part of that. I can tell you for sure that the rich neighborhoods in Los Angeles are very different from the rich neighborhoods in Chicago and Manhattan. And I will show you that in a minute, like with better data. Because this is like great data for the year 2000, crappy data for today because we can do far better. And so I'm going to show you the far better data that we can analyze right now. Okay, but here's the bottom line. So in Chicago, the poor neighborhoods have fewer establishments than the non-poor neighborhoods. In the average city, the poorer neighborhoods have more establishments per 100,000 residents than the non-poor neighborhoods. The average person living in a poor neighborhood is not experiencing the institutionalization. It's not just that the story that there's not people there is wrong, it's that on a per capita basis, they are also not experiencing fewer grocery stores, etc. How could this be? I saw The Wire. Well, yeah, because The Wire is in Baltimore, and Baltimore is a non-representative city. How could this possibly be? Think about NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. In many cities, the rich work very hard to keep all of those establishments and that CVS and Duane Reade and all that stuff away from their neighborhoods because it increases traffic and affects their quality of life. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but what I'm saying, if you start thinking about the actual world, actually it's not that hard to imagine that this might happen. It's just hard to imagine when we have that powerful image that happens to be a wrong image in our minds about how poor neighborhoods actually matter. If you look at small medical establishments, same story. Social service establishments, similar story. Recreational establishments, it's in the other direction. Social establishments, oof. Okay? If you look at the 10 largest cities, I won't go into detail, but the bottom line is Chicago looks a little bit more like the 10 largest cities, but it's still worse than them. And Chicago doesn't even look like the Rust Belt cities at all. Yeah. If you wanted to say, like, well, at least Chicago we know is like, you know, Indianapolis, no. With respect to population density, we just saw, yes. But with respect to even the other stuff, it's just not. Chicago's just weird. With respect to organizational capacity. Yeah.
But I guess like one thing I'm struggling with is wouldn't just by design of the metric small areas look kind of inflated in terms of number of restaurants per person? Because you just have like, if you have a city that has like 100 people,
yeah.
There's some basic things that inevitably every town will have. So like those establishments per 1,000, 100,000 people, those numbers will start to look higher in bigger cities. So, you see what I'm saying?
Not sure. So remember, these are essentially per capita numbers. We're accounting for that. 5 people in each case. We're totally accounting for that. Yes? Those are people, by the way. We're also accounting for that. I think we're accounting for the two things that we're not doing any prediction. This is all descriptive research. But the two core compositional issues that would matter, we're accounting for. We're also accounting for the differences between, well, essentially we're accounting for this by looking at the differences between poor and non-poor neighborhoods and cities. So in a purely descriptive way, the equivalent of walking to all cities and counting not people, but establishments, Chicago's weird. Okay, so that was, okay, that's good. And crap, because then it was like, well, what's happening in poor neighborhoods and how would they theorize, or what we need new theories. But I actually think that that's only as good as we could have done back then, and we can do much better now. The zip code is actually broad. And you probably know if you mail things, which you might not, but if you think about what mail is, zip codes are actually sorting mechanisms for the convenience of the post office. Zip codes are not analytical categories created for the purpose of researchers to understand neighborhood effects. And as a result, zip codes have a tenuous relationship to what we actually understand as neighborhoods in the real world. It turns out that census tracts have a much less tenuous relationship because tracts are designated by the census, and the census is populated by researchers. And so tracts, for example, don't cross railroads that bisect an area in a socially significant way, and tracts take some account into some. It's not full because they still have to be about 3,000 people, some account of the local environment. So a tract doesn't go through a house. A tract that rarely goes through a street in a weird way. But a zip code is literally just, a zip code could be a building. That's just one big building that has a bunch of people in it. They could have 2 zip codes. The University of Chicago is 1 zip code, et cetera. So it's actually not a convenient issue. Second, it actually ignores, okay, so let's, okay, it's so sad that nobody has used the blackboard, but I'm going to use the blackboard. No, actually, people have used it in the past, maybe not in the last couple of days. Okay, so here's part of the reason. In a nutshell, there have been a couple of ways of doing this kind of work before. One is you create an area. Let me step back even further. Remember, the question is access. If I live in a place, how hard is it for me to get the things that I need? And the question is, if I live in a poor neighborhood, how hard is it for me to get those things? In the past, what we've done is 2 things. One is what I just did. You create a geographic area, and then you see for people who live in that area, how hard is it to get those things? The problem with that is that, let's say this is 1 zip code, and this is another zip code, and I live right here, and there's nothing here, but there's a whole bunch of stuff here. I have a wrong idea about what's actually happening. Let's ignore that maybe it washes out over the long run, et cetera, but just in terms of what I'm, especially because this designation is totally arbitrary, I could be missing something important. The second way that was a little bit more advanced, once GPS technology became available, was to measure what people call as the crow flies distances, which means exactly what you think it means. So I'm here, and I just want to find out how far from this space is the nearest bank. That's actually way better, because in an as the crow fly distances measure, I'm going to capture this bank. So these, I don't know, these are banks. That's a person. I'm going to capture this bank, whereas I wouldn't capture any other thing. Way better, okay? But it's actually not as good as we can do. And here's why. I'm going to give you 2 examples. How many of you have lived in New York or know New York? Okay, good. So I lived in Manhattan, in New York, in Harlem. And so this is Manhattan, and this is Central Park. And I lived here at Hamilton Place, yeah, 142nd. If you know the area, that's where I lived. And shortly before I moved to New York, a supermarket, I think it was a Pathmark, was opened right here. As the crow flies, that is super close. This is East Harlem, basically, and I'm in Harlem. I never went to that place. Why? Because the train lines went like that. I would much rather get on the A and shop in Columbus what is this called? Columbus? Columbus Circle, thank you. I moved out of New York in 2006. Anyway, Columbus Circle, or go to Chinatown even. It was faster and just easier, and have to walk down, wait for the crosstown bus, go all the way across. It just took too long. It literally took too long. So accessibility-wise, even though there was a supermarket here, I actually didn't use it. And so therefore, I had a poor measure of access because I didn't take into account literally how hard it was to get there. It turns out that it's actually not that weird. So when I lived in Chicago, have you been around Chicago? Go around Chicago. You should. This is like a great opportunity. It's an awesome city. Okay, so this is Chicago. This is the lake. This is downtown. This is the Loop. 59th Street is here. This is Hyde Park, and we're here, okay? I lived in the South Loop on 18th Street. This is 59th Street. You're like, why are you drawing all these maps? Because again, there is always a data production process. Your data are always something that somebody produced for some purpose, and understanding your data well is going to improve the quality of your work. Okay, when I lived here, I got in my car, went to Lakeshore Drive, drove to Lakeshore, and then came here. And when I went home, I did exactly the same thing. Anything here actually took too long to get to. because it was way faster to get on Lakeshore Drive. And so I never used it. And so even though there was actually some I don't even know what it was. I don't remember. There was a supermarket in here. Somebody might know. On State Street around here. I don't know what it is. There's a supermarket in there. I don't think I entered one time. But I've went to the grocery stores here and the grocery stores here all the time. I did yoga here and in the South Loop. Never here. I don't even know if there's a yoga studio. Again, because it actually took too long to get to. Now, what's interesting is that that always bugged me about that earlier paper. I didn't like it for that reason. But now we actually can get it. We can get these data. So if you have a cell phone, if you need to go, say, to a bank, what you would do is you would literally Google bank, and Google would tell you, here's the nearest bank. And it would tell you specifically, if you click on Google Maps, here's how long it takes to drive or walk, take public transportation, or bike to that bank. Literally how long it takes, which is precisely the measure of accessibility that when I think about it, I actually want to know. Because I want to know how long it's going to take me to get there. I never went to this supermarket. It just took too long. That is actually a much cleaner measure of accessibility, and it's a measure of accessibility that far better accords to how we actually live our everyday lives. And you're like, well, why would we even care about this? Well, among other things, because poor neighborhoods in all cities are not like poor neighborhoods in Chicago. Remember I told you that I got off at 120, whatever it was, and it took me forever to get here? And all I saw were black. First of all, everybody's black, and it was poor neighborhood after poor neighborhood. It was nothing, nothing, nothing. That's a high degree of clustering. In other words, there's lots of highly clustered census tracts together. In many cities, that's not the case. In the poorest, so one of the poorest tracts in New York is a huge housing project that has 150-some people per square mile, okay? That's a tract. 150,000 people per square mile. It's huge, okay? But it is a housing project. You walk 15 minutes from that project and you're in a middle-class neighborhood. In other words, the experience of poverty is actually very different in different kinds of neighborhoods because cities are configured very differently. Now, I can easily think of New York and I can easily think of Chicago because I've done research in New York and I've done research in Chicago. But what's it like in San Antonio? What's it like in San Diego? What's it like in Tucson? What's it like in Milwaukee? All of these are poor neighborhoods in cities that have their own configurations. I think, like good Bayesians, to the extent that we have better data, we need to get those data and update our priors once again. So that's what we did. Yes?
From my point of view, it could play a role if like more people in Chicago like own cars, for example. I guess it's not the case, but I mean that would change the accessibility quite significantly.
Yes, exactly.
If people walk 15 minutes in New York or drive 15 minutes in Chicago.
I think that's exactly right. And I think one step towards getting that is developing separate measures of accessibility that do and don't take into account whether you have a car, right? So literally, I'd want to know how long does it take me to get there if I have a car? And how long does it take me to get there if I don't have a car? And those are different measures. And how long does it take me to get there if I'm just walking? And that's a different, you see what I'm saying? In other words, we want to take into account the car, but also public transportation. New York has amazing transportation, as somebody made the point a few minutes ago. Chicago has pretty good transportation. Houston has terrible public transportation. Detroit, you know, I don't even have to tell you, right? Car city. And so you're absolutely right. And so what we want to do is think about accessibility from different perspectives. Public transportation, car, walking. Walking and see how much they differ. And to the extent that they differ, then we know, for example, how much to worry or in what ways to worry about the fact that car ownership might be different in Chicago. I mean, we know car ownership is low in New York, but it might be different, for example, in Chicago from in Houston. Yeah? So the first step is to actually literally just get the scope of the data. I think it's a great question. So this is what we did. So Microsoft has the same data Google has. Except instead of Google Maps, it's called Microsoft Bing. And so we worked with the team at Microsoft Research, and we did exactly what I just described. We did the equivalent of going to every single block. Every block, but we analyzed the data at the block group and then at the tract level. So every single block, and went to the centroid of that. The centroid is just the name for the geographic center of the block. Went to the centroid of the block, and we did a Google search. And then we got the 3 nearest banks, and then we calculated the walking time, driving time, and public transportation time. And notice, as you know well, because you use Google, public transportation includes sometimes walking, right? It'll tell you walk 5 minutes and take a okay, so that's included in the public transportation time. From every block, we began with a few cities. Now we have it for the 50 largest cities, which is awesome. And we began with banks because we believe the bank data. Turns out, because I've done fieldwork, I know the data are pretty crappy for other kinds of establishments. Although Google, since 2 years ago, a year and a half ago when we began this, actually has gotten better. So anyway, and we got the average. So the average of the 3 nearest. And we did that for every single block in the city. And so what I'm going to show you is that much better of accessibility that takes into account this. Right? Unless I'm highly irrational, right, it's going to tell me which is the actually, in other words, it's for sure going to tell me which is the most accessible bank. And it could be that I'm highly irrational and don't use it anyway. But at a minimum, I for sure want to know what the actually most accessible bank it is if I'm here in a way that obviates this problem and that problem. OK, so I'm just going to show you a couple of the cities. It turns out we have, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe this isn't central to your strategy, but should you really worry that low-income folks in certain communities are less likely to be using loans for this purpose?
Oh, absolutely. But again, yeah. Actually, that's a good qualifier. Because in so many countries, the phone is actually the way your computer is. Notice, this was our strategy for getting our data. But remember, our question is, how does living in a concentrated poor neighborhood affect your access to resources? Right? And we created one measure of accessibility, which is based on zip code data. But we pointed out the problems with that measure of accessibility. We're using this search strategy as an alternative measure of accessibility, not of practice. You see what I'm saying? We're literally measuring how accessible it is. The next step is then to understand practice. But I would venture that first you have to actually understand accessibility well if you want to understand practice well. Because it's accessibility that gives us a sense whether it actually makes sense to say, well, you know what? The Chicago poor neighborhoods are especially inaccessible. Maybe they're not. In other words, maybe they look inaccessible, but maybe it is in fact the case that it's just about as hard to get to a bank in a poor neighborhood in Chicago than it is to get to a bank in a poor neighborhood in New York. And that's what we're going to get. It's almost like accessibility as getting to. How hard is it to get to it? Okay? Then the next step is exactly what you're saying. Say, okay, now how are actually people using? Maybe it is in fact the case that people, you're right, I shouldn't have called it irrational. Maybe people just don't know because they don't have phones with Google or whatever, and they go to one that's too far or whatever it is.
The way they acquire information, even with the same search technology, is just different.
Right, exactly. So a whole bunch of things could happen there. This is like the one step prior. Absolutely, absolutely. Yes?
The fact that we're looking for a bank and probably bank branch matters, could that potentially have an effect? Shouldn't we look, otherwise, shouldn't we look for a distance or access to a thing that is common or uniform? Because I was thinking of gas stations. Like
I see.
Gasoline instead of banking services, because gasoline, it doesn't matter if you get one or another brand.
Yeah.
But Chase versus JP Morgan, I don't know.
Got it. No, I understand. And the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is we began with banks because I believed bank data more than other data. Literally, that's what this was a pilot. It turns out that now we have data for some 50 or 60 different resources for the 50 largest cities, because the coders developed better algorithms, and we got more data, more computing access from Microsoft. It took once we finally figured out nailed the programming. We got to the point where it would take 2 weeks to do one large city. I mean, it just takes for tons of, think about it, it's a lot of Google search, and every single block in a city takes forever. But anyway, so you're right. I remember I said the research is ongoing. I'm actually not even going to show you the 50 largest cities because I didn't get the data in time enough. And, yeah. Wow, this is such a piece of cake. I can speak so quickly. But we also have check cashing places. And I don't have the figures, but I'm going to tell you the answer in a minute, which helps answer your question. In some places, people use check cashing places instead of banks, for example. I'm going to, for a number of reasons, like, you want to send money back to Bogota or whatever it is. I totally get it. I'm going to only tell you the cool findings because I didn't have time to put them in the table. But okay, first things first, just banks. What does it look like? Okay, here's what it looks like. So here's a map. Very quickly, so the city, as you can imagine, ends there. That is just the mapping program that takes the track. It's a technical issue. Just ignore it. And the reason I'm going to ask you to ignore it is because you can see a lot of black on the outskirts, but that is not the edge of the city. This, as you know, is the edge of the city. The same in Chicago. Just ignore, right? Chicago ends there. Ignore this. I'm sorry. I just apologize. I couldn't get the person to do a better job before the presentation. Okay, so what you're seeing here is how long does it take to drive to the nearest bank? No matter where you are in Manhattan, it takes less than 5 minutes. Even in Harlem. How long does it take to drive to the nearest bank? Lo and behold, you can get to a bank in 5 minutes anywhere in the north side of Chicago. This is downtown. It's split up this way because for data reasons, we couldn't do the entire city at once. This is one of the many technical problems that got solved. So anyway, this is north side, downtown, south side. In the south side, by and large, it also takes about 5 minutes, although there are some areas where it's going to take you between 5 and 10 minutes. Okay? Now you know. It's pretty cool. If you have a car, it's actually fine. What about other modes of transportation? Again, don't let that black scare you because all of that doesn't mean anything. Like, just try to remember, and I apologize again, try to look at the right edge of the city, right there. Okay, there's driving. You saw this already. Easy everywhere, except notice, of course, I didn't point this out earlier. If you're in the middle of Central Park, it's going to take you about 5 to 10 minutes because you first have to get to a place where you can drive. Yeah? You have to literally walk to Central Park West or whatever it is, and that is my alarm going off, but I am going to ignore it because I'm so confident that I can totally get to the airport on time, and this is just so interesting. Okay, if you walk, it's going to take you longer for many places, including where I used to live. It takes 10 to 15 minutes where I used to live in Harlem to get to a bank by foot, also from the middle of Central Park. Public transportation is actually very consistent because in New York, you have to kind of walk to the public transport, et cetera. Okay, and here's the data in Harlem versus the rest of Manhattan. Driving is about the same, but in walking and public transit, it starts taking a little longer. What about Chicago? Driving, you saw this already, very similar story. But walking and public transit, this is what happened to me. I got on the train in here, and I was supposed to get off, maybe around here, I can't quite tell, and I got off way down here. And there's nothing. Look at all of this. You literally have to walk more than 15 minutes to get to the bank. And what's scary is that even in public transportation, it can take a heck of a lot longer. Chicago poor neighborhoods in the south side are deeply inaccessible in a fundamental way. Not just in a hypothetical way in that there's not a lot there, but you just can't get there. And this just shows you the data. I'm going to show you this one and then tell you a story, and then I'll have to wrap up. This is what happened. This is the first few cities that we did. Somebody had asked about this, somebody over here. This is in all neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods, and this is the difference. Okay, and if you look at the difference, what you're seeing is, so negative means it takes longer in the poor neighborhoods. This is why I love actually doing actual research. It's interesting. When it comes to driving, it takes longer in Chicago. But actually it takes a bit of time in New York too. A bit longer, meaning in the poor neighborhoods than the non-poor neighborhoods. You see that? So yeah, Chicago's a little weird, but in respect to this, it's actually not exactly an outlier. It's just kind of out there, And the other thing I just wanted to point out, there's more to talk about. I know, but we're out of time. LA, isn't this great? It's positive. Why? Because in LA, everybody drives everywhere. You don't want that stuff near your house, in your mansions and stuff. You want it near a highway. You want it, right? You want it near the place you work, but you don't want it screwing up your vicinity. So in LA, in South Central, and so in those neighborhoods, it's actually easier if you have a car, which most people will do, to actually drive to where you need to drive. I'll give you one more piece of, this is the correlations that confirm the story. Okay, this is, in other words, the poorer the neighborhood, the longer it takes. That's all that says, except in LA where everything is weird. So the other thing we did was we started looking at the ratio. So this is a simple accessibility measure, but you notice that when you begin this way, you can start beginning to model the decision-making process by at least modeling the choice set. What we started doing is took the idea that, as you know, a lot of people in African-American low-income neighborhoods use check cashing places that charge exorbitant rates to cash your check instead of going to a bank. It's a common problem. We started looking at what is the ratio of the nearest bank to the nearest check cashing place. Notice it's another descriptive question. But it's an important one because understanding the ratio helps you understand not just accessibility, but kind of the quality of accessibility and the way you might think about the process. It turns out that there's a lot of different ways of looking at the data, but in a very basic way. Obviously, the poorer the neighborhood, the more the ratio favors check cashing places than banks. Yeah? That is not a surprise. Yeah? In other words, the poorer the neighborhood, the more it's closer to get to a check cashing place relative to a bank. But what's interesting is if you just take poor neighborhoods and just take neighborhoods that are predominantly white, excuse me. Just take neighborhoods that are predominantly white. And you try to figure out at what ratio does at what poverty rate does the ratio tilt in favor of check cashing places as opposed to banks, right? So presumably in a neighborhood that has no poor people, it tilts favorably, dramatically towards banks, yes? And the more people you have, the more it starts tilting, and at a certain point, it's going to flip so that it's more rational to get to a check cashing place because it's more accessible, yes? So the question is, if I only take white neighborhoods, at what point does the ratio flip? And if I take black neighborhoods, at what point does the ratio flip? If I take black neighborhoods, the ratio starts flipping by around 15% poor. A neighborhood that's predominantly black and 85% non-poor, by that point, it already flips and it stays flipped. Among whites, it's extremely hard to actually for it to ever flip, depending on how you, because remember we look at driving, walking, and public transportation, and I don't remember for which it never flips. It's just always easier to get to a bank than to a check cashing place, regardless of how poor the neighborhood is. But for the other measures, the neighborhood has to be about 80% poor if the neighborhood is predominantly white, for it to finally be rational to get to a check cashing place as opposed to a bank. It's beautiful data. Those data I'm writing up right now, it'll take a few more months. And by the way, for that project, we did some regressions, fixed effect differences. I'll just tell you, we did some regressions, and actually the story holds up. It's not a question of, we'd actually even looked at the access issue. So we looked at the distribution. We looked at it in a whole bunch of ways, but we also looked, for example, at whether the character of poor neighborhoods was different if they were white, and of course it is, but access to richer people doesn't actually make the effect go away. Basically, you can't make the effect go away. You cannot. The race effect is strong and pervasive, and it doesn't matter. It's not just a question of rationality. Unless you think that African Americans think differently about banking than others, it's a very, very, very strong racial effect. Anyway, there's obviously more, but I'm running out of time. I've run out of time. Thank you so much. I hope I've given you something to think about. And good luck. Please think hard about your data. I hope if there's one thing you measure, like really, there's other kinds of data, and thinking about them seriously will alter how you interpret your own results. So I hope you take them seriously. Thank you so much, and good luck as you continue in this path in your future academic and intellectual endeavors. Thank you.